together, talk about issues on our mind. We've got a few presentations to come from Keith Henderson and Curtis Fossey. Those will be on basically the status of our constitutional woes and the level of staying Canadian we're seeing from our current provincial government actors. And Marissa will take us into healthcare issues, which, if you haven't noticed, there's a few with the way our systems are working nowadays.
Is it working?
So with that, I'd like to jump into it. What we'll do is we'll get into the presentations. Like I said, that'll give us some structure. But really today's all about us. So topics on your mind, about who we are, about what the party's about healthcare, about the notwithstanding clause. Keep those questions in mind because we're going to try to free up as much time as possible, really just to chat with you all and about what's going on today. So with that, we'll start off with Meredith here. Give us a lesson or two on what she's seen as a healthcare.
So I'm a former candidate for the Canadian Party of Quebec and currently co-leader and healthcare. I probably won't be presenting much on healthcare today, but if you have questions and so on, of course, please feel free to mention. Mostly want to focus on the Canadian, staying Canadian topic. So let me ask you guys a question, warm up the room a little bit. Tell me, are you fed up with living in a province obsessed with the decline of French? Yes. Are you sick of living in a province where bilingual education is not available to everyone? Yes. And are you frustrated by living in a province with a complete lack of government accountability?
Yes.
Definitely.
That's a big one.
We're in church. Could we have an amen? Do you remember the time when you wrote to your local leaders and actually received a reply? Do you fantasize about a balanced provincial budget? Would you like to file one set of taxes a year? Do you remember when housing was affordable? When you could pay for groceries and save for the future? Do you wish people would stop telling you that you are the best treated minority as though you weren't contributing to society and culture? Are you tired of being told if you don't like it here, you can move to the rest of Canada?
Yeah.
Do you hunger to feel at home in the place that you actually call home?
Yes.
Are you done living in a province that doesn't uphold the Canadian Constitution or Canadian values? Do you wish you could express Canadian national pride without fear of reprisal? Do you remember singing O Canada? I'd like to go back in time. 1994. First time I voted, provincial election. I was a John Adams student, was studying in a political science, introductory political science class, and I was super excited to vote for the first time. And I remember feeling really hopeful and anticipating that with a positive feeling. And following the PQ win, a lot of us at John Adams Medical School were quite concerned with what would happen. And so we were discussing this with a poli-sci teacher, and she was trying to reassure us that change was healthy and that this was a good thing and nothing for us to worry about. Fast forward a year later, only my second time voting. But this was a little bit more scary. I wasn't naive and hopeful at this point. We were quite anxious about what was going to happen. And in the weeks leading up to the referendum, both yes and no sides were working really hard. I think you probably all remember that. Trying to get the message out. And I remember, so I went to French school and English school, so I had Francophone friends and Anglophone friends. Some of them were voting yes and some of them were voting no. And it was actually really terrifying, and I felt really misunderstood by most of the people around me. And anyway, so that was, we all remember how loud I was, and that all the Canadians had come across and did the rally, which was kind of exciting. And in the anticipation of a yes win, the First Nations across Quebec had started holding their own pre-referendum referendums. And 95% of them asserted that they wanted to remain Canadian. And so they were able to do that in anticipation and protect their rights. So I don't remember voting day, but that was a nail-biting day for my family. And I remember anxious phone calls with friends, and my mother and I were crying on the telephone as the results were coming in, because like, oh my God, we're going to have to move, what are we going to do? And we realized with the results, I don't even remember them, that every vote counted. We've seen a little bit of that with the recent federal election opinions. Yeah. So the no was 50.58%, and the yes was 49.42. Really not here. And what was interesting, though, and what I noted, and I think people have talked about afterwards, is in the immediate aftermath, despite some questionable comments by Mr. Capital, what was surprising was that there were no riots, there was no violence. It was basically peaceful acquiescence to what had happened. And I think if that we were all in shock, and that Canadians realized that we were completely unprepared, what would happen if, in fact, the yes had won? So, following that, local Quebec municipalities began to pass their own resolutions, their own state resolutions, which was super interesting. But more interesting even than that is that municipalities outside of Quebec, so across Canada, were voting also, if they're staying Canadian, to recognize the staying Canadian resolutions which were passed. So, what does staying Canadian look like in 2025? So unfortunately now, despite many municipalities in Quebec passing the staying Canadian resolutions, those municipalities essentially no longer exist. So whatever resolutions were passed are no longer in effect. So because the Quebec provincial government changed the municipality boundary lines since the referendum, they eliminated the cities as entities, and they basically created a whole new entity, and so the staying Canadian resolutions don't count, they're obsolete.
Is that deliberate?
I would say yes, but that's not perhaps the most generous interpretation. I think it's probably a power grab in any case, whether it was just with that in mind or whether it was with a bunch of other things in mind. So anyway, so the municipalities are no longer a local parish, and you really kill many birds with one stone. You get rid of self-governance, and you create a provincially run region. So the provincial jurisdiction applies, not the local jurisdiction. Funding decisions are made at the provincial level, not the local level. They get rid of bilingualism, so you can't have the bilingual status is now subject to provincial standards, not local standards. Percentages of French versus English speaker in a given municipality. So what happens is you'll be considered unilingual French. It's sort of assumed. It's like innocent until proven guilty. Well, you're French unless you can prove otherwise. So the failure to prove the bilingual status in sufficient numbers gets rid of the bilingual status, erasing English or any other language program, regardless of what's happening in those local places, those local jurisdictions. So as we approach the potential for referendum 3, there are some sobering thoughts. The Parti Québécois seems to be leading in the polls still, and they've promised to hold a referendum if elected. Now, how much will they hold to that, we will see. But we also know that the CAP has spent basically 8 years preparing the province for separation. They're just doing it incrementally. The opposing parties, Liberal, Quebec Solidaire, Conservatives, they're unwilling and or incapable of providing any real opposition. I mean, we remember that they all voted that unilingual Quebec was a unilingual French province, and they all voted and endorsed that. So, I want you guys to think of 3 main points as we approach the potential for referendum 3. We want to be prepared this time. So, we want to think about federal responsibility to all Canadians. So, if First Nations people could pass and retain Canadian status, and that this is recognized, this is maybe something we should be looking into as a nation. Second thing to think about, informed consent. So before we go into a referendum, you want to know what you're actually voting for. So what would it mean to separate? What do we retain? What do we lose? All of that. So we want to really clarify what that means before we vote. And we have a democratic precedent for one of the proposals that Canadian Party in Quebec is making. In the Swiss canton of Jura in the 70s, they were able to do a series of referendums to divide different cantons. And they did that very peacefully. So we have a precedent, we have the idea of informed consent, and we want to really know what we're getting into before we get into it. So, what did we do? We made a combination of the Swiss model and the First Nation referendum. We know that we need federal and international recognition. So we're asking ourselves, since municipalities are provincial ridings and not recognized outside of Quebec, how are we going to get some funding to be able to do a pre-referendum referendum? We want to look at the ridings that voted no. We want to look at the ridings that passed unity resolutions. We want to see if there's any overlap. Are there federal ridings where these ridings would gather people together? In the spring of 2024, we sent letters to the federal leadership with this request to hold a pre-referendum referendum. In the summer of 2024, we went to Ottawa. We presented at the press gallery in Parliament, making another appeal for the federal government to supervise a referendum in federal ridings in Quebec. So we'll see. They haven't yet responded. We're not going to hold our breath on that, but we're hoping that in 2025, maybe we can move forward with more requests and petitions for this kind of referendum. And given the recent sort of pride in Canada and Canadian pride stuff that was going on with the federal election, we may land on more, better hearing, better willingness to hear our appeals. Any questions? questions so far? Great. So I would say that the federal engagement in 2024, their rate is F. They didn't respond to us, they haven't shown any interest, despite many requests on our part, and despite challenges to bills 40, 21, and 96, and despite citizen activism such as yourselves. We're hoping that in 2025 they will take this more seriously. So here's some food for thought. We want to think about support for a separate Quebec at a provincial level, and will that mean that the international and provincial power that are based on the CaPQ since the federal government so far has been disengaged, we want to get them more engaged. This is something that's very important. And how do we get the rest of Canada on board? How do we get them to see that we want to stay Canadian, that it's important that we do, and that not all Quebecers want to leave? I like to think that the Canadian Party of Quebec, in Quebec, is the equivalent of Bloc Québécois in Ottawa. And I think of us as a bridge, actually, between French and English, Canada and Quebec, and unity overall. Just as an aside, as an anecdote, so my own father came from England to Quebec to teach at McGill, but he ended up supervising students at McGill and also at Majestic in Montreal. And at his recent funeral, there were people from francophones, anglophones, all mixed up from those schools and many departments. And I felt like that was really representative of the true Canadian, the true Quebecers, that we all mix well together. And also, yesterday was at an event with friends from elementary school, which was French, and friends from high school, which were Anglophones, and we were all speaking together, we were all around the kitchen, and we all get along just fine. And so I really want to, it's a message of hope that we're sending forward here. We want to stay Canadian. We love Quebec, we love Canada. We can work together. There's no reason to be sort of polemic about it. So we're really looking at that unity. So I'm hoping you all, if you're not already members of the Canadian Party of Quebec, I'm hoping you will become so today, and we can help you with that. And you should know what we're fighting for. You all have some handouts on your tables you can take a look at. Feel free to take some home with you and to hand them out to friends and colleagues. And if you have any questions, I guess that's it for me.
Next up, we have Keith Anderson, who you may remember from various efforts from the community over the last few decades, but most importantly, the intellectual progenitors behind really what became the Clarity Act. Keith will take us through a lot of that history, and more technically than kind of what Murtis went through, what we're trying to do very democratically to ensure that should we come to a referendum in Quebec, that can actually be held on democratic terms, and the result be one that's representative of the population, as opposed to smaller pockets of it. We'll also deal with this chirping little microphone effect. But Keith, maybe if we just keep it there, it might work. You're a little too tall for this game. I'll let you figure it out then.
I thought it was something
Thank you, Joe. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Thank you all for coming today and taking the time. That's really wonderful. What I'm going to do is go through a policy on staying Canadian. And some of you, I hope all of you, if you're not already members of the party, become a member of the party, because on the 7th of June, we're going to have a big convention, a policy convention. We're going to be talking about staying Canadian, and Murtis is still seeing health. One of our first policy conventions, and you're all, of course, invited. 7th of June, I'm not sure if it's a Sunday or a Saturday, I think it might be a Sunday. And we're also officially introducing Joe Cianflone as the leader of the party. Now what I'm going to do is walk you through slowly the policy that we're going to be presenting, and adding a little bit, explaining what we're doing. I won't go into the weeds too much, but I'll try to be as precise as possible. Number one, there are about 12 different segments, but they're short, so bear with me. The imposition of the notwithstanding clause paralyzing rights in Quebec forfeits the constitutional protection of Quebec's territorial integrity. That's not well known, but I'll explain. The Constitution of our country says, yes, the federal government can change borders and add provinces, but you can't change the borders of a province without the province's consent. And the separatists love that. They say, you can't change Quebec. They say, we can change Canada, of course, because they're hypocrites.
Yeah.
But you can't change Quebec. Our borders are protected by the Constitution. However, it is also true, and I'll get into it in a little bit more detail, that you have to treat your citizens equally and without discrimination in order to benefit from protection of your territorial integrity. Successive Quebec governments have imposed the notwithstanding clause, which means you can't even go to the courts to have your rights adjudicated. That is pure and simple discrimination. It means that they have forfeited the right to territorial integrity. So that's the first statement we are making in our policy declaration. Here's a quote. In the 1998 reference case, the federal government took to the Supreme Court. They said, can Quebec secede unilaterally? Are they allowed to do that, court? And the court gave its big, long answer, basically saying no. But as part of that answer, here's one of the important quotes. A state whose government represents the whole of the people or peoples resident within its territory, on the basis of equality and without discrimination, is entitled to the protection under international law of its territorial integrity. We'll just reverse that. If you don't treat your citizens equally and without discrimination, then you don't have the right to have your territory protected. So it's implicit in what the Supreme Court has already stated. By invoking the notwithstanding clause and thereby shielding its legislation from judicial review, the so-called state of Quebec, and the Quebec government loves to call itself a state, they don't even call itself a province. The state of Quebec no longer represents the whole of the people or peoples resident within its territory on the basis of equality and without discrimination, and hence forfeits the right to territorial integrity. So that's vital segment one of the proposal. Number two, the Canadian Party of Quebec maintains that the future of Canada must be decided by all Canadians and not by the outcome of a referendum held only in Quebec on the basis of a 50% plus one vote. Very important. As part of the law, and I'm stating this is what the Supreme Court has already decided. If there is an agreement on secession, that's a huge if, the whole agreement has to be submitted to the Canadian people via constitutional amendment. Everybody gets to vote on whether they accept that agreement or not. So it is not just Quebec that decides, oh, we're leaving. No, it is Canada and the Canadian people who decide. And this is not emphasized sufficiently. This is not in the interest of various governments to irritate nationalists by reminding them that it's all Canada that decides on the future of the country and not just Quebec. But that's a very important fact. Number three, the Canadian Party of Quebec believes that if Canada is divisible, so is Quebec, and that the rules governing the establishment of the boundaries of an independent Quebec must be laid down now, before any secessionist referendum, not afterwards. Now, Murtis has already suggested this very important concept. Remember, before the second referendum in 1995, the natives, because they have certain powers, they run their own show in certain ways, they could conduct their own referendum, and they did. The Cree and others, they said, if there's a yes vote, you want to stay in Canada or you want to go with the new state, and they voted, as Murtis said, 95% to stay in Canada. So they had the right to say, and this, I emphasize this native referendum took place before referendum 2. So the results were already in. If it's good enough for natives, why isn't it good enough for Canadians? Why can't we decide whether we want to go with this new state or not? Unfortunately, cities don't have the power to conduct a referendum because they're creatures of the province. If they tried to do a referendum like that, the province would shut them down, so you can't spend money on that. We're not allowing that. Obviously, we're not going to have a provincial referendum to say, oh, we're going to divide up Quebec. The only government that we have at our disposal where we can express ourselves is our own federal government. And they're the ones who are responsible for our rights as Canadians anyway. So they should ask us, what do we want to do? And we have to pressure them to do so. Now, we have two liberal parties in Quebec. We've got the federal Liberals and the provincial Liberals. They both have the same name, and people are easily confused. And you know something, I think the politicians like them to be confused. Because the federal government can say one thing, oh, the Liberals believe this, and the provincial government can say exactly the opposite, and people, okay, what do Liberals really think? Well, here's an example. Here's a statement from the Supreme Court of Canada, again from this important reference case. Quebec secede, all by itself, yes or no? In that reference case, they stated the following. This is the exact quote. Nobody seriously suggests that our national existence, seamless in so many respects, could be effortlessly separated along what are now the provincial boundaries of Quebec. Let that sink in for a moment. Supreme Court of Canada stating, no one seriously suggests that the borders won't be changed. That's what they're saying. So the court itself has given legal license for partition of the province. And the government, this was way back in 1998, took 3-4 years after the referendum for all this to take place. The government, at the time, Chrétien's Liberal government, read the judgment. They said, okay, what are we going to do? And they made a law. The law was called the Clarity Act. And it was passed in 2000, 2 years after the Supreme Court made its judgment. And here's a quote from the Clarity Act, which is absolutely consistent with what the Supreme Court already said. It states, no minister of the Crown shall propose a constitutional amendment. Notice, they recognize you have the constitutional amendment if there's going to be secession. To effect the secession of a province from Canada unless the government of Canada has addressed in its negotiations the terms of secession that are relevant in the circumstances, including any changes to the borders of the province. So they're not going to agree to anything, the federal government, unless they have negotiated changes to the borders of the province. What does that mean? It means the partition of Quebec is already part of the law. It's part of the Clarity Act, which was passed by a substantial majority. All the Conservatives voted for it. All the Liberals voted for it. And even though Chrétien at the beginning in 1995 said, oh no, I'm not going to refer any of this to the Supreme Court of Canada. This is a political matter. It's not a legal matter. He said this. We have it in writing. Finally, after the referendum was so close, and he almost lost the country, he changed his mind, and he decided, yes, this is a legal matter, produced a law called the Clarity Act, and a year after it was adopted and passed, he said it's the best thing he ever did in his entire political life. So don't tell me politicians can't change their mind. Sometimes they do, 180 degrees. I stress, partition, change of borders is already part of Canadian law. So if you read in the Gazette, oh no, it's not possible, what's going to happen, we don't know. We've already been on that. It's part of the law. We've got to negotiate the borders if there is a yes vote. Number 5, remember, this is all part of the Canadian Party of Quebec's policy document, which you guys, if you attend this, are going to get a chance to vote on. This is number 5. If on a clear question and by a sufficient majority, separatists win an independence referendum, I know that's a big if, but you never know. And if by constitutional amendment Canada agrees to separation, also a big huge if, then the Canadian Party of Quebec will insist on keeping to the maximum degree possible all Quebec voting poll districts which vote to stay Canadian within Canada. What does that mean? If we conduct a federal referendum, we take the results and we analyze them poll by poll, and we try to keep as many of those polls that voted to stay in Canada within the boundaries of Canada. That's what it says. That provides a mechanism for creating the boundary, which doesn't right now exist. The Clarity Act is very good up to a point, but it does not specify how the territorial rights of Canadians are going to be protected. And this is how it would work. Here's a referendum, it's done democratically, it's done peacefully, and those who wish to stay in Canada get to stay in Canada to the maximum degree possible. There's history for this. There's Canadian history for this, which you're not going to read about in the Gazette. The Northwest Territories was huge. And in the middle of the 1990s, the Inuit people of the Northwest Territories said, you know something, we would prefer our own territory. Federal government, we would like you to divide the territory. And the federal government said, okay, we're going to do it by referendum. And they conducted a referendum in the Northwest Territories, and it turned out that the people of what is now Nunavut voted in favor of a separate territory in which their own Inuit language and culture would be more respected than it might have been in the past. All peaceful, all democratic, all Canadian, so don't let anybody tell you it can't happen in Canada, it already has. So if you want a history, there's one, there's another, which Murtis has already alluded to. The Swiss federal government in Switzerland was petitioned by the French-speaking minority of Bern, which was a German-majority canton. Cantons are more or less equivalent to provinces. They said, we don't want to be part of a German-majority speaking canton anymore. We want to have our own canton, please. And the Swiss federal government said, well, you have enough petition, okay, you've reached the threshold, we'll conduct a referendum, which they did. And then they, on the basis of the referendum results, they created the boundary. And right now, there is a new canton from the 1970s, so it didn't happen yesterday, but it happened recently. In the 1970s, the new canton of Jura was created and still exists, peacefully, democratically, by referendum. So it is possible to do this kind of thing. Number 6, before any Quebec independence referendum is conducted, the Canadian Party of Quebec advocates holding a Quebec-wide, federally supervised referendum, just like the Swiss, to give all citizens a chance to choose between Quebec citizenship and Canadian citizenship via the following question. Now they can come up with their own question, obviously, if they follow the suggestion they would, but here's our suggestion, which is part of our policy, and the question should be, as a member of the Canadian people in Quebec, and I've stumped on that, natives are a people, Cree, Inuit, but guess what? Canadians are also a people. They have their traditions, their values, their passport. We have a passport. The Quebecois don't have a passport yet. We have one. We are a people. We have our history, our traditions, our bilingual civil service. We exist already. And are seen at the United Nations. We are members of the Canadian people. So as a member, do you consent that the government of Quebec and the government of Canada separate Canadians and your local territory from Canada in the event of a yes vote in any Quebec referendum on independence or provincial secession? You consent. If you vote yes to that, you're saying, okay, I'll be part of the new state. If you vote no, that means no, I want to stay in Canada. That's what we're suggesting. Subsequent to the establishment of new boundaries, people having voted yes and thereby choosing Quebec citizenship will enter Canada only as visitors and if accepted as immigrants. So there won't be any suggestion that, oh well, you know, you voted to become a Quebec citizen, but you can have dual citizenship, not a problem. No. We're saying no. You come as a visitor or as an immigrant. You don't automatically keep both your citizenships. Number 7. The boundary between a separate Quebec and Canada should be negotiated only after the federal referendum. That's obvious. It's the referendum that is the boundary determining mechanism. Canada should include but not be limited. Obviously, those who vote to stay should be included. Include but not be limited to all the Aboriginal lands in Quebec, that part of Rupert's Land, northern Quebec, now administered by Quebec, and a land corridor linking Ontario to the Maritime provinces through Montreal. That's our policy proposal. That the Maritimes should not be left like Alaska without a land link to the rest of the country. That's what we're proposing. Number 8. Canadians living outside the new Canadian boundary should be compensated by the federal government for moving into Canada. Let me stop on that, because I go back a long way. And I remember when Meech Lake was being debated, we had Brian Mulroney and all the rest of these conservatives saying, no, Meech, it's got to be Meech. I remember somebody asking, what's going to happen if Meech fails? What do we do? And the answer was, well, you're going to have to move. You're going to have to move. Canadian representative telling Canadian citizens, well, too bad for you, you're going to have to move. Now, there may be some, if we go through this referendum process. We're trying to keep those, most of those who want to stay in Canada will not have to move. But there may be some, goodness knows, maybe in Chicoutimi or whatever, who, okay, I have to move, and we're saying they should be compensated by the federal government if they have to move into Canada. Compensation will be paid from Quebec assets held in Canada. Quebecers who choose to remain Canadian should have their Quebec pension plan assets and benefits transferred to the Canada pension plan. So that's number 8. Number 9. If ever Canada agrees to separation by constitutional amendment, the boundaries and status of that part of Quebec which stays Canadian should be negotiated by representatives of federal, provincial, and territorial governments and by those Canadians living in Quebec who have voted to remain Canadian citizens. We should be at the negotiations. We will not have, because it's an interim position, we won't have a provincial government per se, but we should not be left out of any negotiations. We should have our own reps. They should be there. They should be explaining what we want and why we want it, so that we're not left out as we so often have been. Number 10. The Canadian government should support the rule of law, the primacy of the Canadian Constitution, and the territorial integrity of Canadian Quebec with federal authority and justice. Why is that important? Because during the aftermath of Referendum 2, when Lucien Bouchard and other separatists were saying, oh, we're going to have Referendum 3. Now they're at it again, of course, you know that. During that, this was in the 1990s. The Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs at the time, federal, Stéphane Dion, he was the one who shepherded the Clarity Act through Parliament. He wrote a letter to Jacques LaSalle, who was his provincial separatist counterpart. And he said to him, you know, we got a big problem here. We've got to settle this problem. And he was the one who raised the Swiss example as a means of settlement. But he said, I noticed that whenever you're asked about what's going to happen if there's a yes vote and how are you going to enforce it, you keep talking about using the Quebec police. Well, I don't want you to use force. This is not acceptable. You should not be using force. Now, I am paraphrasing, but I have the letter which he wrote to Jacques LaSalle. So I'm not mischaracterizing what Stéphane Dion said. He said, you say you're going to use the police, but you shouldn't be using force in the police. This is a matter that should be settled democratically. Hence, this importance of number 10. The primacy of the Canadian Constitution, supporting it with federal authority and justice. So there will be no use of the Quebec police force to reinforce a yes vote, should there ever happen to be one. Number 11, the Canadian government must oppose vigorously and consistently all illegal provincial legislation intended to affect the secession of the province from Canada. What does that mean? Okay, you can have your referendum. We can't stop Quebec from having referendums. It's just a glorified opinion poll anyway. It has no legal effect. You have to understand that. It's an opinion. It doesn't have legal effect. But if they went to the legislature and said, okay, we have a referendum, we won 51 to 49, and now we're going to do this and this and this. If all those thises are illegal, the Canadian government has the right to do something about it. Just the way the Spanish government, central government, did something about Catalonia. The Catalonians tried the same thing, introducing all sorts of separatist legislation, and the central government in Spain said, okay, you're under arrest. This is illegal. So this is not an irrelevant point. It is vital that Canada assert its legal authority against unilateral declarations of independence and illegal activity by the government of Quebec, should it ever come to that. And as I just finished saying, there are examples from Europe where this situation has bubbled up and occurred, and Canada has to be prepared to do exactly the same thing. Why? Because the Americans are vital to any recognition of a unilateral declaration of independence. If the Quebec government says, but the Americans are okay, they're on our side, and so are the French. International recognition is an important feature of this problem. But the Americans have said, it's part of their policy, you, Quebec, have to demonstrate that you have expelled any competing law from your territory before we will recognize you. Translation? If the RCMP offices still exist in Montreal and still function, and the post office is there, and the courts, the federal courts are still there, they have not expelled any competing authority, and they have to do so for the United States of America to recognize them. And that's why we're saying the Canadian government must vigorously and consistently oppose all illegal provincial legislation to demonstrate to the rest of the world, no, our authority still exists and we're not giving up. Those are the 11 points of our policy. I hope you make it on June 7th and vote in favor of it. We can move one big step forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Keith. Really appreciate the reminder on both the background and kind of the framework. I'm going to take it in a different direction. Try to boil this back down to where we're all at, and then really try to chat about kind of the troubles that we see. Right? There's a big history to all this, but in 2025, we've got a more recent history to worry about. First is, in my mind, for many of us, Bill 21. Just watching the government start to pass, obviously, ethnographic legislation. Are there issues with immigration? Yes, there always have been. Our families, at some point, we're all immigrants. It takes a while for us to come together as a people. Does this legislation do anything about that? No, not at all. What it does is it just basically creates distance between government and its people, which is a theme that I want to keep coming back to. Bill 96 did it differently. Bill 96 was the Quebec government planting a flag and saying, we have no obligation to you if you don't live your life as a francophone in public. You are basically not considered a member of the nation of Quebec. That was important, and we raised that as a task force when I was in the middle of founding that organization, because it's clearly part of a multi-step program that has now gone a few more steps since then. Bill 84, more recently, moved from the nation of Quebec that excludes so many of its citizens to the nation state of Quebec, getting ready ultimately in this notwithstanding clause normalization to have that referendum we see on the horizon and make a unilateral declaration of independence using the notwithstanding clause, ignoring the Canadian Constitution and everything that should be done around such a scenario. For many reasons, the chief of which is that it's not 1917. There is no League of Nations. The United Nations doesn't recognize any government trying to be ethnographically suppressive. Are there a lot of dictators in the room? Sure. They're in the room taking the heat because they're trying to run the government, which historically started in that way, the way Quebec is trying to shift its government today as only serving who it defines as part of the Quebecois nation. This is nonsense. It's super well subsidized nonsense, right? This is federal government subsidy, provincial government subsidy, departments at major universities here. These are law professors' entire careers, having never been actually in international law, but instead been publishing in our own press world in Quebec and Canada a bunch of legalistic sounding nonsense is what it boils down to. So that's why I'm here today. I'm not a politician, as you can tell. I don't plan on being one for a long time. What I am is a builder. I want to see institutions back in our community and in Quebec that are defending the right ideas and the right culture of democracy. We are far, far from that today. As Keith mentioned, for a lot of legal reasons, and as Bertus mentioned, for a lot of human reasons, things are happening. But for me, this is simple math. Right? We are 9 million people in Quebec today. 6.4 million have the right to vote. That puts an impetus on 2/3 of people voting already to be protective of the 1/3 that's too young, infirm, or ineligible to participate in the democracy of our society. But a third already can't vote. And of that 6.4 million that can, we get about 4 million voting. The CAQ has won the most recent election with its landslide of 1.6 million voters. Right? The PQ, Quebec Solidaire, and the Liberal Party each had another 600,000 votes. Add all of that up. That's 2.4 million people for all 4 major elected nationalist parties, and they're all nationalist parties, we'll come back to that. 2.4 million people pretending that they are the majority, that they democratically represent Quebecers, or that their ideas aren't exactly what they are, extreme and designed to isolate pockets of voters. And that's what they've done for decades. We all live in real Quebec. We go outside, we get along in any language, in 3 languages for most of us here in Montreal. It's a beautiful thing that doesn't exist in most parts of the world, but ironically exists pretty heavily in Europe, where we're always referencing France, and they have the same rate of bilingualism as we do here in Quebec, which is astounding if you think about it. But the issue we come down to over and over again is we've got 2.4 million voters getting carved up into 1.6, with the CAQ running around 100% of power. That's 18% of population, right? 5 out of 6 people in this province did not vote for the CAQ, okay? 5 out of 6 people in this province will not have voted for the PQ when they win the next election. And in any Liberal Party's delusional mind, 5 out of 6 Quebecers won't have voted for them either. This is great for politicians, right? It makes a really easy game of dividing everybody, bringing up the same nonsense for 50 years, letting Quebec's GDP per capita decline from the leadership in North America to now the, unfortunately, poorest place with the exception of our Atlantic provinces. I have to throw that asterisk in because I know there's a lot of people who want to be technical about it, but if Nova Scotia and Newfoundland had the benefit of Montreal and major universities, I don't think they would be so inclined to point out an exception like that. What we've done to Quebec, what we've done to Montreal, takes an especial effort to throw away 325 years of economic leadership in the Americas. And it's been very successful for everyone but our people. For everyone but those 5 out of 6 people who don't vote for any of these parties that then pretend like they have a mandate to do things like alter the country, alter our constitution, and get involved in our lives. That's what I have a problem with. So my name is Joe Chanfloy. I grew up here in Montreal. My family's been in Quebec for 200 years. I'm an Anglophone. I'm accused constantly because of my Italian last name of not being an Anglophone. Actually, I'm an Anglophone, like I immigrated here 30 years ago, right? It's this kind of underhanded culture that, quite frankly, doesn't exist in most of the developed world anymore, that we've normalized in Quebec, that is setting us back, right? So that's why I do what I do. That's why I'm here to fight for this party and its set of values. Again, those 2.4 million voters and those 4 nationalist parties, whether it's the CAQ, whether it's the Liberals, whether it's the PQ, or whether it's Quebec Solidaire, not one of them has accepted the Canadian Constitution. That's 1982, all right? It's 42 years later. Right? There's no more excuses for pretending to be Federalist, right? Not one of those parties promotes bilingualism. All of them, unanimous vote after unanimous vote against waving the Canadian flag on Patriot Day. And that was, by the way, at a Desjardins branch in Ontario. They'd never dare in Quebec. But in case you haven't noticed, we named this party the Canadian Party for a reason. And that's because the Canadian Party of Parizeau did not fight for French nationalism or for English nationalism. It fought for the death of nationalism. And these idiots today running around waving the Patriot flag and talking about the Patriots spitting on our ancestors' legacy is insane. By using the word Quebecois to mean anti-Canadian and resurrecting French nationalism like it's imperial times, we can't abide this anymore as a people. Again, the cost has been too large for 50 years. Why am I here saying this? Because I'm one of the few people in my generation that is not attached to the Quebec economy. I don't run my business here. I don't have to worry about being promoted at my company. I don't have to worry about the structure of coercion that I've been in before here, that all of our kids go through. And not just Anglophones, not just allophones. My Francophone children face the same thing. It's 1.6 million. It's not 9 million, right? Nationalists are not the same thing as Francophones. Separatists are not the same thing as Francophones. And as long as we continue to let our current political leaders divide us, as if there is that linguistic divide, when this is really all about cornering your vote with fear and nonsense history. So that's why I do what I do, that's why we do what we do. And yes, there is a referendum coming. If you're paying attention to the way these laws are being created and the way funding is being gathered, this is again going to happen, and it's going to happen at the hands of a very loud, very small minority. And because our parties do not encourage decent political dialogue, it could be very close again. Because we don't end up having a referendum on the real issues. We end up having a referendum on emotions that people know. So do you think 50% of the population would ever vote for a referendum? Not if they understood in a minute what it entailed. But that's the game. The game being played is to keep everyone ignorant and dig our heads into the sand if you're on the Liberal or Federal side. Or on the nationalist side, continue to beat your chest, get on every Quebec or wherever you have, and pretend you represent people. But you don't. And unfortunately, in that paradigm, there used to be a Canadian federal government to keep things in order. That's what's changed. Past history is the past, and I think a lot of it is defensible, and some great things have been done to create Quebec and Canada that we know and love today. But the recent abandonment of Canadianism by our own Canadian government, all parties, let's be clear, all parties. There's no elbows up on anything like defending our own constitution here in Canada. Not a single one of these parties has done the basic job of being the supreme legislators in this country, and they don't intend to. That's why we're here today, and that's what I'd like to talk to you about today. You know, is it evident to everyone in this room what's going on? You know, are we aware? Where are our kids? You know I'm here because I've got 4 Francophone stepkids who have very little future with the way this government is running this province. And I've got a 27-month-old baby who I need to think down the line, is this a soldier in World War III? Is this someone who's going to be ethnographically obviated from the economy, or even healthcare, or access to education? There are different peoples in Quebec, that's for sure. And it's time to have the real conversation that we have been avoiding for 50 years, which is who is still Canadian and who is not. We need to confront that reality, and we shouldn't be afraid of that reality. Some of us are here to tolerate others, to defend both of our official languages vigorously, and who know damn well that representing and fostering a culture doesn't mean attacking and eliminating another one. And yet, we have others who do that. It's sad we have to stop to give that applause, all right? As much as we want to criticize many other provinces, many other countries, this stuff doesn't happen elsewhere. Even where there's leaders of countries that we really dislike, they're not doing this to themselves, right? But here we have, and we will sacrifice everything. We've shown, whether it's the economy, our education system, our long-term care system, our healthcare system, the priority for governments like these, all parties will always be language, grandstanding, and buying votes. Well, it's our healthcare, our grandparents, our children who suffer. All languages, all cultures, all Quebecers, all Quebecois suffer under this kind of politics. So that's why we're doing what we're doing. Not a technical argument. There's plenty of technicalities behind all of this. You could lose your mind on it in 4 weeks, trust me. And if you tried to read something like Bill 96, which causes you to open up 24 other acts and read all those, it takes 2 days. It's not fun. But the nice part is most of these bills, unlike in the past where there's subterfuge, are very honest. The first 2 pages make it very clear what this government believes. And this is not tolerable in any democracy in the Western world. And so we need to push back, right? We don't need to be in power. That's for people who are happy to trade away those principles. We need to call those people out, and we need to call them to order. And in the meantime, we're going to continue to build this structure and hope one of them, a lot of them claim to be about the people, right? A lot of them claim to want to get the right job done. I invite any of them to come and lead this party. We'll support you building a federal party too. We've built the institutions. Keys are to any one of these politicians who want to show up for what they're actually talking about. And in the meantime, we're going to do that job for them on both an informational ground and a political ground. So again, my name is Joe Champione, born here in Montreal, excited to get more and more involved with the Canadian Party of Quebec after founding it a couple of years ago. We did run in the last election. We ran in 25 ridings. We had over 14,000 votes, which made us behind the Green Party, the 7th biggest party. We had 7 weeks to register that party at the time. We're looking really forward towards next year's election, retooling everything, getting everyone involved over the summer, and just coming out with constant messaging. For those of you who don't know, the way politics work in Quebec is votes equal money equals resources, right? Given what we're defending, democratic principles, Canadian values, politicians who are actually attached to decent results for the citizenry, if we could fund this party like in a normal democracy, we wouldn't have to badger you to let you know we need you to join the party and we need you to vote for us. But the way we actually suppress democracy in this country, in this province, is by making sure there's no funding outside of your votes and the small amounts of personal contributions you can make. So I do apologize if I have to keep hammering that home, because there's plenty of people who would love to write big checks to defend important principles, but they're not allowed. So this is the system we're working within, right? And it's pretty adverse. But the one thing that's not adverse is the basic truth. The basic truth is on, I think, most people in this room's side in terms of how we want to be treated and how we want to see others treated by the government. We just need people willing to say it. So that's who we are. And with that, I'd love to open up for questions and really up to the panel and really get talking about
This is the best.
Let me take a seat so we can all sit and chat. Yeah, go ahead.
I appreciate what you said, and I agree with everything you said. The issue that from my perception anyway, is that since the starting of the Canadian Party of Quebec, we don't have a strong voice. We don't have a lot of inroads within the province. And I don't think that there are many people in the Beauce or the Saguenay who even understand that the Canadian Party of Quebec exists. I've or to Maris or to Colin, I mentioned this personally to Colin, but would it not be a consideration to turn this whole deal over to francophones, to build up in the Beauce and Saguenay and everywhere else in Canada, in Quebec, another option besides the PQ and the CAPQ and Quebec Solidarity, because really there are no options now. They're all, like you say, the same. They're all nationalist parties, and I know that there are people in this province that don't want that. They're tired of the quiet revolution and the 60 years that we've gone through this, and seeing Montreal reduced to nothing. You know, we're a have-not province. We have our hand out every year for billions of dollars from Alberta because Bill 101 has been successful in driving away all of our economy.
Yeah, and you know, quite frankly, Bill 96 is a much greater success. Like a much greater success. I mean, we are setting up for economic depression here in a large way. It's hard for me not to see things that way. I'm a Harvard, Oxford-educated economist. It's just kind of where I come from. So, you know, it really is critical that we figure out that the damage we've self-inflicted over 50 years took us from effectively being one of the richest sub-states within one of the richest countries to now the most rapidly declining GDP per capita within the most rapidly declining GDP per capita amongst the G10 nations. Right, so just when I was in high school, you know, we had about a 10% discount in GDP per capita to the United States. It's 25% now. As Quebecers, it's closer to 50. Right, so like at a certain point, you have to start asking yourselves, you know, I mean, where is our economic, cultural, linguistic, etc. security coming? To go directly to your question, this is I think it's our 4th state Canadian event, right? So the first one we did in Mont St. Bruno, we were in Hudson. This might be 3rd today because we postponed Shawville, right? So Western Quebec. So we are very much not the Montreal-centric version of the way this worked in the past, potentially, right? We are here for the Canadians in Quebec. And like I said, my other half is Francophone. You know, my family in Victoria is Francophone. These are all Federalists, right? We found someone in the West Island who I hope is going to end up running in Jacques Cartier, who's a Francophone. You know, the difference is, listen, we have the advantage in the fact that we're sort of like the poor and attacked minority, right? For us, many of us don't have the opportunity set of just put your head down and be quiet and you'll get promoted at work and you'll be a senior VP. Right? That's what the Francophones face. Right? The Francophones face, you know, a different kind of coercion, which is like every loudmouth business leader, if you've read our press, is very nationalist or they don't talk politics at all. Right? And so you get the same two things in sort of educated, middle class and up Francophone society. Either it's the loudmouth separatists and nationalists, or people don't talk politics at all. And it's a problem, because at least in the past we had the Jean Belizeus, right? And you mentioned the Quiet Revolution, right? I think we can get along with the Quiet Revolution and Jean Lesage and those principles, right? It's stealing that for nationalism. Like, let's be clear, nationalism is not patriotism, right? Patriotism is great. Nationalism is the excess of patriotism against others, right? There's a line you cross there, right? That's created, one can argue, every war in the world just by crossing that line. You know, and what you base that nationalism in, whether it's ethnic or religious, it doesn't matter. It's just a bunch of sociopaths trading power, and people are the victims. So I'm with you, but the truth is, we have let the situation go to such a point that it's really hard for people to raise their hand and be heard on this, let alone be on camera or be public with it. So I have these conversations quietly with people from all kinds of walks of life. That's why we do this, is we know they're there. And we started, again, first with the task force. Before that, we started just a few of us calling myself, just making outreach to people. You know, and before all of it, I started with reaching out to Anglade and half the people who are still elected in, you know, M&As right now, and then federally and in Ontario. Like, you know, we've done that, right? We know that the institutions, the people who should do something, are all not going to do anything, right? So I appreciate where you're coming from, and I want us to get there, but here's the plan. Traditional media has no interest in fostering this debate, right? That's not their fault. You know, if you're in any newsroom right now, you're trying to survive, right? You've seen the layoffs in the English media right now. I mean, you're just trying to survive, right? And unfortunately, you take that You add TikTok and a lack of a linear culture, you add no 6 o'clock news bringing people together. We're in infotainment times, right? No one's gonna get into the heart of why there's a concerted effort to destroy what it is to be Canadian, or what I would define as Canadian exceptionalism, that this effort has always been based in Quebec, that it's effectively repeating imperialist nationalist tradition. Like, no one's gonna do that work anymore. Every once in a while someone publishes an article, but not enough to sustain any momentum. Federally, we've seen everyone trade away, right? Just trade it away. So, one debate we've had is, well, shouldn't we just agitate the PLQ? I mean, again, we've done that. The point is, and I'm good friends with ministers who used to be in the PLQ and who stood for rights. And quite frankly, listening to their own experiences, like advocating for the right things with Robert Barassa, like why? Why would we continue to fight this party? Like, the party is what it is, right? It's always going to be that vehicle for compromise that thinks there's something to compromise. It's not the vehicle that talks to Francophone Quebec society that's proud to be Canadian, right? It's the vehicle that has decided that Francophone Canada within Quebec is at best soft nationalist. I reject that. I just don't think that's true. So you could find a couple of people who might fit those seats, but they'd probably not fit the values right now. The truth is there's bigger work to do, building the organization and getting us away from this Quebec war monopolization of ideas and revisions to history. So I regret, we can't just become like a majority Francophone party, but I understand why I don't get a lot of those emails right now.
Joe, I think it's clear that we're never going to be a majority party in this province, but maybe everybody would like to hear what type of a difference we could make if we had 1 or 2 seats in the National Assembly.
Sure. Well, so firstly, and just kind of extending from where we just were. So the plan is basically our own distribution, right? It has to be. You can't really count on kind of traditional media. So a lot of you know us from Facebook. We're taking this summer to kind of invest in our tech platform so we can really get out to Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok, right? We need to go after the youth. We need to go after that non-voting population of Quebec that's being thrown around as if they support any of this stuff. So that's kind of the kind of detailed plan. What that means is, where is impact in today's politics, right? So in economics in general, we talk about the margin, right? You can have billions of people who are demanding a good and who are supplying a good meat, right? But it's not as important that you have the billions as it is the last couple that transact, right? Those are the ones setting the price. It's no different in the market for ideas, right? And that's what's been such a failure in Quebec and now federally sponsored Quebec lack of politics, is that we don't have parties actually proposing different ideas, vigorously debating them. Instead, we have parties who are all unanimously voting on the first read of every bill, so that you and I and everyone in Quebec never hears about the stuff they're legislating on. That's not the news anymore, right? That's not what we put in the news, because we don't have parties who are debating that for a living.
It's all one party.
It's one party, and that's where maybe, Cynthia, there's something that has specific teeth, which is, within the BNA Act and Canada Act, right, there is no concept of a provincial constitution. Unfortunately now, all 4 elected parties are tripping over themselves to be the one to bring this to life. Now that, we actually have no understanding of what that means, but what it at least at a minimum means is it puts up a pretty significant challenge, if allowed to happen, to the supremacy of Canadian law within Quebec. Now the parts of BNA Act that reference this occurrence and sort of imply what would be the power set after are sort of section 90 and 45. And there is something to be said for all of that happening unanimously, i.e. so for the training, the nationalist beating and whipping of all the people who call themselves legislators in the Assemblée Nationale over the last 10 years, getting them into that immediate unanimous voting mode, so that when they actually pass something like a Quebec Constitution, it's passed unanimously, and then could arguably be the supreme law. And again, what does that mean for us? 40 years of legal challenges, destruction of the community, pretend of court challenges support from Pablo Rodriguez, who rejected every court challenges application except for the EMSB, and then turns around and says he's all about protecting the community here, right? This is what we have to avoid. Is falling into these legalist traps, is getting into the lawyer class, playing the media game. This has to be about democracy, or there is no point. Either people want to take back how our society works, and whether it's working at all for the people, or it's time to, quite frankly, just describe the game, which is an extraction of an elitist class constantly. Constant and cyclical extraction from the people. That's what Quebec is. It's not left of center, it's not right of center, it's not socially avant-garde, it's just an extraction state from its people. And this is the tool that's used. So, we've got to make that decision. If that's what we want to call politics, then let's keep voting for the same parties. They're doing a great job. If we want to change it, we can't do that overnight, right? That's a big machine that's been allowed to happen. Someone referenced it, right? That's $300 billion of aid from Canada for what should have been a failed state, the way it's been governed over the last couple of decades, right? So the population doesn't learn that lesson, that it can't demand these nonsenses, right? And the politicians who don't care and will say anything for those votes also don't learn any of those lessons. So we have no political class right now that I would have faith in. I mean, put it this way, would you give them the keys to your business? No. If not, I don't know why we're letting them run the budget of the city or the budget of the province. But that's what we're doing. So we can play that game, or we can go a different way. I'm going to go this way. I'm not saying we're going to win majority government in Quebec. That won't happen. But quite frankly, as long as we're allowed to talk, that's what matters.
Yeah, it won't happen the next election.
For now.
Maybe later.
Next
Maybe
one.
hey.
For now,
I love to believe that what we represent here represents the majority, the actual majority of Quebecers who love each other, love our country, want a strong province, know that Quebec is different than anywhere else in Canada, just the way it's the same way anywhere else in Canada is different than Quebec. And don't find a reason to blow everything apart because of that. Right? There has to be those people. That's who I'm investing in.
we're finally there's a party that gives another choice to the population, and I think it's only a matter of time, over time, that people are gonna wake up. So
I think there's pros and cons, right? We're in a tough scenario right now where a lot of the voters are still the end kind of Quebecois demographic. I mean, so they just got their newsroom too, right? That game is also ended, right? That's why they're getting so big on TikTok with the nonsense now and talking about Canada in the 1820s
Well,
and
that's what
leading
I'm saying,
the
right?
bounty Quebecois, right? So
there's hypocrisy, so they're just gonna switch, they're gonna go with the wind.
exactly. And so, we need to build that distribution. We need to have the right kind of messaging there. Hopefully we're going to see, we all grew up in Heritage Canada and sort of things reinforcing our history on TV. Like, hopefully we'll see a reinvestment in that. It's been pretty absent from the federal government side for a long time, and that vacuum has been really well filled with other forces here in Quebec. But I think the truth is, we all know, just talking to people, the majority still believes in Canada and wants to see a strong Canada. And if anyone wants to be, dividing that up now, I think that's a real conversation that we need to have on the nose, not in shadow boxing ways and not in the courts for 30 years, but on the nose. Who wants out, who wants in? Because those of us who want to see healthcare, education, transport, the economy survive, need to see those become priorities again. Not language within economy, not language within healthcare, not language within education, right? Those are not priorities, right? The language is a modality. It's the way we serve those services. And in this country, it should be in both official languages and accommodative of anyone else we can. This is nonsense in 2025.
I like the idea that you're going to the TikTok way. So I speak to French students, and my niece is an English student. And just by her looks, she went to Notre Dame Hospital for stage, and she was not treated as an equal. And she said, "What can I do on the road?" I sent her here. So you really want to do something? Do that. And I speak to the French students that are in my area, and they have to, when they're working at the ETS, which is technology, all coding is done in English. So the more proficient they are in English, the better coders and the more they'll advance. And they're saying, our family treats us like we're traders when we're really English. Where can we go?
This is the
Really
point
want
to
make a
the
difference?
general.
That's
new
what we're gonna do,
generation.
because it's not gonna happen by itself. You've got so many people that are biased against you, whether by color, language, or the way you look. I'll never be part of that club. I know that. And I don't want to be part of that club. But I'm selling by going the TikTok way, which is today's way, of speaking to tomorrow's kids. I think that we can tell them, you have an option here.
Yeah.
And I bet you'll get a lot of Francophone children just going away because they need to learn English.
They're not, we teach children hate, right? They're not born, right? We teach it, and then we create social structures that reinforce it, right? And this is a province that has trouble admitting its own systemic discrimination. Right? That's like, well, we have mothers on the news of First Nations dying, like on camera. We can't see that. So, there is a big divide that the government loves to create around identity, and 100%. But I mean, what we need to accept, even as a minority, is that exists within the quote-unquote majority, right? Because that fractured francophone society is really the struggle, right? It's its own internal tension, right, between some of these really base and simplistic forces and some really beautiful forces that think that by being quiet and trying to pen them in, they're doing the right thing. Maybe 50, 60 years ago, right? But the balance of power has changed, right? It is TikTok. And so when these people are able to have a disproportionate effect on our reputation, on people's sense of security, on a tourist experience in Quebec, right? I mean, we don't see the 99% on TikTok, on Facebook, right? We see the 1%, the worst of it, and sometimes on both sides. And that's why we have to get in the middle and do something different, right? Because, again, the system doesn't, be very clear. If I wanted to be a politician for a salary, this would be all the wrong things to say, right? And that's one of the troubles in Quebec, is that with the destruction of our economy, we don't get a lot of people raising their hands for these jobs that have great alternative options. For a lot of people, that's the best job they're ever going to get, right? Is being an elected official. And there are a lot of great reasons to do that work, but those are not the reasons that I'm talking about for those people, right? It's just the biggest salary and the best pension they could possibly get, right? And
I'm just saying that there's an opportunity there.
Yeah.
Because, some of these kids, their uncles and that won't talk to them anymore.
Yeah.
Because they're learning code in English.
I mean,
But
I
that's
know
not happening
family-
for us, like a party like us. I like to say us, sorry. But,
It's us.
Because you've got English people like my own daughters saying, Dad, why would I lose an opportunity because I'm not part of that? Or I'm seeing them. They're perfectly trilingual with my kids.
Yeah.
4 people, German and Mandarin is 5. But they're not seen that way. And
Not here, right? So I mean, look, I'm a Quebecer. When we leave the province, right, we speak French proudly. It's well received. It's a major asset, right? It's only here where we're just told off for even trying to speak French, right?
Yeah.
We're just not even allowed to try in the work environment.
But what I hate to hear is when my kids tell me, Dad, I can do a Bermuda and pretend I'm working in Montreal just on the laptop. I don't have to be here anymore, Dad.
Yeah.
I don't have to take this anymore, Dad.
So if I moved back from Bermuda, what I can say is I can be here and not work here,
But
which allows me to not be part of that coercion.
They're not
right?
stupid. They're not stupid, these children. They know what they can get away with.
Yeah.
And they're not going to deal with this crap anymore. And they're not going to fight either.
And they are not interested. They're just not interested.
That's why when you mentioned TikTok, it's a great platform to say, here, watch this.
Yep.
And you can maybe say, this party stands for one, like Mr. Henderson always gets the right 12 points in there. Make it short, sweet. You're losing this, you're losing that. Bill 96, they have the right to go into your business and without cause or warrant, seize your electronics. They probably won't do it. There's old people would never do that. But that's in the law now.
I mean, they've done it. I mean, everything they say they'll never
But those
do.
kind of points are going to get us those kind of votes.
Yep.
That's just my opinion.
I like that.
And if there's any ad campaign you ever want, I'm a pretty good writer.
Right. This is a volunteer organization. Everyone is part of the party. Everyone is valuable hands. However you want to contribute, please.
But if you want votes, if you want a lot more people to join your party, I think you have to hit the minorities, the groups, different ethnic groups. You have to go out there. Because when I work on the federal campaign, we went to the English community, the Indian community.
Yep.
We went to the Black community. That's where we got the votes. And we went and met them. And the head of the party at the time spoke to them. He set up appointments, he set up meetings.
Yeah.
That's what you have to hit. Especially here, to be honest with you, especially here in LaSalle, if you want votes, writings, Indian votes. Hit the Indian community.
Yep.
And if they like you, they'll vote for you. They're very strong. They are very, very strong.
So look,
And we also have
it's
Black
funny because
community.
I'm Italian. I have a good part of my family that's Jewish. We've got a lot of Irish people,
Yeah.
and my view is, we've got great strong communities.
But
Slow to
you have
move.
hit them. You have
Slow to
to hit
move. The Indian community has been amazing.
Yes.
So
Yes.
Cynthia, who does a lot of our community relations, has gotten us to a lot of events. There's a gentleman who used to live here in LaSalle, has actually lived out in St. Lazare now, Parjinders, helped us come together with the Sikh community as well. We went to some of their cultural events.
Very strong here because
Absolutely.
we
Because LaSalle has always been a great place to integrate Canadian communities. I mean, I'm Italian, like I said, my cousin owned 16th Avenue, 4 blocks away. My dad owned Bar Roma and Villamar on Monk Boulevard for 30 years. You know, I know the area.
But I know that the Indian community, because the MP in my riding, she's Sikh, and they come in by busload.
Well,
You had
the culture is one of public service.
Yeah, and for the federal election to elect her, you have to be the age of 14. And they came in busloads, kids from school, just to vote for her.
Yep. Good. Where are our kids? That's right. That's, you know, the question I ask, but it goes to a point, you know, which is they're disengaged.
And the red jacket one.
Debbie and the gentleman next to her. Yep.
Okay, thanks. Thank you very much for your hard work on our map. It's very inspiring, all of everything you said. I'm trying to boil it down to the takeaway for me. I mean, the takeaway for me, do you want in or out of Canada? But the fact that you guys have kind of hit a brick wall, you've reached out to the federal politicians, and they haven't been willing to exert their federal legal authority on any of this stuff that we're living day to day. I mean, I guess I still have hope. You know, Mark Carney has said he's going to defend his constitution. I'm meeting with my new MP this week to talk about Bill 96 and Bill 21 and the work of the task force.
Yeah.
I still have hope. So I'm still fighting the good fight. But what do you want us to go away with? What do you want us to do?
I always ask people to just try to energize a couple people around them, because this is complicated stuff, and I don't know that there's a good overarching narrative, except for that people who trust other people need to know, hey, there's a real problem. It's not just our perception. It's not just a feeling. Like, there are real things that have been changing underneath the surface that are not acceptable. They're not to the majority of Quebecers, and that's being suppressed in the system that we have right now. That would be my big takeaway. And I too, Debbie, like, I'm very hopeful. You know, in this job, I can no longer kind of really be affiliated with the task force, but you know, I was at our last court engagement, and it's tough to watch the Attorney General of Canada come in with the Canada Act and say they have not accepted a unilateral amendment, but then staple Bill 96 to it, hand it over as disclosure. This is now the Canada Act with Bill 96 attached. But we haven't accepted the amendment. Like, the amount of people who are willing to think out of both sides of their brain, let's forget talk. Like, I mean, these people believe their nonsense. Right? This is a pathology at this point, right? And it doesn't change internally, right? It's a cancer, right? And it is pervasive throughout both the federal and provincial levels of government. And we got to do something, right? You let that grow, and it just keeps growing. So, you know, I appreciate everything you do and the task force continues to do. That's incredibly important work. And listen, hope, we're the hope, right? We exist. The 5 out of 6 Quebecers not represented by the government exists. And it's our job to peacefully continue to remind them. Because quite frankly, I mean, listen, this is the peaceful era, right? We haven't had a referendum wave, as much as we talk about peace, 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 that hasn't been violent. Right? We like to pretend that that's not history, but every referendum wave in this province has been violent. Every single one. So, you know, I don't know where this narrative comes from our press, but I remember the bombings in the 90s. People remember the FLQ in the 70s. You know, we're going to, pretty soon, I don't know if you caught what the Native Americans, you know, are doing recently, but they're kindly asking Canada to remove a lot of their timber resources from their land. Now, asking, this time. Like, we are on a powder keg of things here. And by continuing a regime of suppressing sort of 70% of the population, like, we're not going to make things better. So, you know, I really hope our politicians wake up, because it's not okay to have the youth completely disconnected from politics, not watching our news at all, not aware of what's happening at all. Like, that story doesn't end well, whether it's 5 years from now, 10 years from now, or 15 years from now, or maybe 2, but it doesn't end well.
Just that lady's point over there, when you went out to these groups, the problem with now is the funding comes from the government. Even for Heritage News article, whatever, the funding is taken over by the government.
We didn't have to have funding, we just went into the.
No, I mean, when they're looking for funding for organizations,
Yes,
they have to go to that.
Yeah.
And if they're in a bad light, we probably won't get this funding. We could be throwing away money because we're associated with the party that's, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It's all about money.
It's a society of coercion, right?
The Black community has a center here, and we also went to the Sikh temple, which they invited us in. Things like
Yep.
We hit there, and we also had to have, before we left, sign papers that they were becoming like a party of the Liberal government at the time.
Yep.
Yeah.
We're on it.
Yeah.
And if you want to help, Cynthia has been an amazing connector for us with the communities. We always need help with that.
No, no was a provincial, it was at the time, yes. To be honest with you, to be fair and honest, the one I represented didn't win. The woman
So
won.
we're all past liberals
You know?
at some point.
No, I'm a liberal, no, he didn't win the campaign, he was, I was going for him, but he didn't get elected.
Yeah.
She won out. Because not that she was better, she had the people
Gotta
behind
bring a
her.
vote.
Yes, yeah, yeah.
Sir.
I've been told to state my name and where I come from. My name is Mario De Bureau. I emigrated to Canada when I was 5 years old from Italy. So, you want to call me Anglophone, an allophone? I don't care. I am who I am. I'm a Canadian. The reason I'm here today is because I'm sick and tired of acquiescing to being treated as a second-class citizen. I am not second-class. And any society that treats their citizens as second-class is a second-class society. I've, Myrtle said, had a whole bunch of questions. Do you want this, or do you want that, and do you want the other thing? For me, the number one question is Canadian. And it's not even Anglophone, because allophones are treated, everybody who's not a pure souche is second class. Keith, you talked about legal stuff, the Constitution is this and the Constitution is that. I'll give you a little example. Saddam Hussein, before while he was still in power, passed a law saying, I am immune. You can't touch me. You know what happened to him. It doesn't matter what the law is, what the regulations are, what the Constitution is. I remember in referendum 2, they were ready, and they got 50 plus 1 to take over, and they had some Canadian generals ready and willing to use force to execute their declaration of independence, regardless of anything else. Give you, to get to my last one, I want to be quick. In referendum 2, I live on the West Island, and in the writing, the rules of the referendum is one vote, not by right. So our objective is to get the most votes out. We organized. We got a 92.5% participation, which is exceptional. We were the first. We were the riding in the province that had the most number of votes percentage in the riding, and 88% voted no. Okay, but how we did that was through a lot of organization. We had people offering seniors to go pick them up and bring them to the riding, to the polling station, and going back. And we called them. We had people in the riding saying, "Who hasn't voted yet?" And we went up again. That's what it takes. Joe, one of the things you said is you said I'm not a politician. That's a good thing to say. I disagree with you. You're a politician. You're not a politician in the bad sense, but you're in politics.
I'm Italian, I'm a debater.
I know what you mean, I'm Italian too. But I think we've got to get into what we need to do. And the question here is, what do we do? form the government. I mean, I don't think that's ever going to happen holding us, but we got to get somebody that can talk about us. And so, this is the first time I heard it. And I'm going to say, where were you all my life? Where were you all my life? Okay? I'm very proud of you. I think you're going to be a great leader. I want you to continue. But nobody's heard you. I heard you because I came here. 25, 30 people. This is nothing. This is nothing. We're never going to get anywhere like this.
Yep.
We got to do much more than that. And so the question is, what do we do? We have to, I think, if we're going to go into the convention, the number one thing that we should be talking about is how do we get power? How do we get one writing? How do we get two writings? How do we get three writings? And so when something happens, okay, there's always going to be somebody from the federal, the Canadian party that's going to say, here's my point of view, and you're going to get heard because that's what we need. And until that happens, we're going to be fringe. I mean, before I came here, I was thinking of knocking on the door to the Liberal Party and trying to get something there. Impossible. We're a hot potato. Anybody is going to avoid us because they think mistakenly that if they say I'm Canadian, they're going to lose all the francophones. I hate to say it. And I remember Trudeau took a lot of heat for saying one thing. He says, it's an insult to francophones when you tell them that the only way they can get ahead is by stepping upon the Anglophones. That it's an insult to them. Okay? So I would like for us to discuss getting power. And I would like to commit to you that I'm retired now. And I would like to commit to you that I am ready and willing to go back to what I did during the referendum and knock on 100 doors, 1,000 doors, 10,000 doors to get one of our people back.
I want to thank you, Mario, but before we go into another question, here's my commitment to you. So I work, like I said, I'm an economist. I work in AI at this point. I'm a CFO at 2 different healthcare businesses. What I'm doing this summer is trying to get our, basically, infrastructure set up so that we can stay organized. So if you look at what's happened in politics, and just in general with people, it's hard to get people together in a room, period. Now, there's great value in doing this because, I don't care what you say, meeting face-to-face matters, and it's great. But online, more than 40 people here today, this is going to be viewed 5,000, 10,000 times, right? And one of the problems we have is that we haven't set up the infrastructure, so we haven't had the money to do it, to make sure that it's not 5,000, 10,000 times, but it's 100,000, 200,000 times. So that's what we're working on now. And I'm going to get that ready for us. I'm going to facilitate what is in the end still ground game and personal connection, right? So my commitment to you is knocking on doors, is showing up to those events. I've been at a community event every 2 to 3 weeks for the last few months since Cynthia started QCN, right? We're getting out there. We know it's not a traditional media solution. That's not who's going to promote our party. We know it's not the people who are comfortable, right? Those are not the people who require their space in this system to work. I mean, those are the people in office now, right? And their family members. We need to talk to real Canadians who are out there and who are by far the majority. And hearing your story, my story, like this is the beauty of it, right? Like I say I'm Italian, you say I'm Italian, and I'm a dual citizen, but my dad immigrated here in '57. Why was he able to immigrate? Because my grandmother was born here and back and forth for 200 years on both sides of my family. You look at the Patriot flag, right? It's not the French tricolor, right? The Jacobins were already back under empire. That was the Carbonati. Right? Those Italians who have been in North America fighting for freedom and teaching people how to fight the church and the nobles for hundreds of years. The Sikh community, same thing. 200 years of history in Canada, starting more on the West Coast, but still, these are not new communities, right? And here in Quebec, we're still talking about everyone who didn't come off like a colonial or slave ship as if they're new people to Canada or new Quebecers. This is insane to everybody, except that media chorus and that political class. So I agree with you. We've got to knock on the doors. We've got to get people out. We've got to show them there's a different way, which is the one that they're perceiving every day, the real world. That's what we're for. So I really appreciate your support and encouragement.
I think the message that we have is not a fringe message.
Yep.
It is a majority message. And the only reason why we are where we are is we're not getting into the press. We're not getting covered the way we should. And that's why I think having somebody in Parliament, somebody at the National Assembly,
Yep.
should be our #1 priority.
I agree. But also the system is the reason, right? This is a first past the post extremist encouraging system. When we had 6 p.m. news curation and everyone was in the same cycle and the water cooler talk the next day normalized it, you still ended up with pretty reasonable camps, right? That's not what we have. Now we have everyone living in an individual echo chamber of fact and reason, and then these parties getting more extreme to divide it up. Because why? I mean, we did the math. With 18% of the population, you walk around like you control and represent 100%. 5 out of 6 people didn't vote for you, but Francois Legault, PSPP, all of them walk around ready to redesign our society, ride roughshod over our actual history, and quite frankly, tank this country because they don't represent everybody, right? So we need to bring that to attention, right? There isn't one politician you can look at a straight face who shouldn't be campaigning for democratic representation, representational democracy, not this first past the post nonsense. So I'm with you, we're gonna do it, but we gotta change the system, for sure.
So my only point is what Cynthia said, what Mario said, it's not power we're looking for, it's voice. We need a voice. And so, we can be your voice, you can be our voice. We need to be heard.
Let's pick a few items and let's lean in hard. One thing that we did last time, and we got a lot of pressure, was, are you going to run candidates in 125 ridings, right? Which is like, start a company. Are you going to sell to the whole world all at once? That should be your day 2 project, right? But in politics, there's just this major detachment of reason, right? And we tried to accommodate that. We ended up running in 25 ridings, which, in retrospect, I would have done half, right? Because there's a balance to be had in terms of getting votes, because votes equal money, money equals voice, voice literally, money equals time on TikTok, putting those ads on people's way. So that's important. But at the same time, we were a bit diluted, right? Because it's a lot to run the campaigns, and you're supposed to basically be a well-funded existing party to do it. So that's the part we have to cut through, Mary. It takes a lot of organization, but it also requires us to be really organized. And that's what we're doing right now. And then we're going to need your help.
Yes, I just had a question for Mr. Henderson, but to Mario's point, don't forget there was 6,000 to 11,000 votes that were discounted because the person put the X outside the circle. Those votes were destroyed 2 years ago by a Quebec judge. So don't forget that the next referendum will also be fixed.
Yeah.
Against us all the time.
Democracy, right?
The other question I had for Mr. Henderson is, I met a friend named Mr. Bear. He's one of the council at the Mohawk Council here in Quebec. I sold him a beer making kit. Anyways, he said to me, Mr. Gandy, we have no treaties with Quebec. We have treaties with Canada. And Quebec does not want to publicize how much land they would be losing if they say separate. Does that mean we lose that land? And we don't think so. We don't have a treaty with the French. We have a treaty with the government of Canada. It was a really interesting point. I want to know what you think about that.
No, I 100% agree.
He gave me a map.
Yeah.
And Quebec was this small.
80%. It's 80%.
I could not believe it. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Well, the whole of the James Bay Power investment would be lost because it's Cree territory, and it would, and they've already voted in anticipation of a second referendum. They wouldn't go. They want to remain in Canada. I'm sure it would be exactly the same in referendum 3. Not only that, a good part of Ongava which is the old name of the Northern Ireland, which was given to Quebec, I think it was 1912, by the Canadian government. Well, the Canadian government would take that back. So a good portion of that, and it might even be as much as 80%, would be gone because these were, let's say, gifts by Canada to Quebec to administer as a province. They were, that's what it was. It was not a gift to become an independent country. So they'd have every reason to reclaim it and reduce the size of this independent state.
When Quebec joined the Confederation, the federal government gave them land, they could take it back, right? When
Listen,
they-
they gave administration of treaty land.
That's right.
Nothing that happens, the government does makes it not treaty land.
Yeah, that's right.
So-
It was during the Constitution, they were given it when they joined the Constitution.
And so that's why Quebec is always talking about its territorial integrity,
That's right.
because there is none. And it also doesn't date back to Nouvelle France. I
That's
mean,
right.
Quebec, honoring a First Nations name, was chosen by the British in 1774 for the Quebec Act, maybe 2 years before, as they formed it up and helped spark the American Revolution, because of giving rights to French in the first place. But that's our actual history. Right, the Patriots who wanted to join the Americans, had they succeeded, we'd be as French as Northern Vermont right now. The actual history of Quebec is fascinating,
It is.
and a partnership
Yeah.
that's always led to its success. This modern revisionist nationalist nonsense has nothing to do with any of those traditions.
But to that point, the Indian fellow said, we can discount it. And why can't we say that we're not doing this? You know what I'm saying? And I have nationalist people, strong nationalists in my neighborhood, putting up Canadian flags. It's the weirdest thing I've ever seen.
Yeah.
Usually in Proper Park, you don't put up any flags, you know what you're part of. And they're putting up Canadian flags. And little ones that flap in the wind. Like, I can't believe it.
I grew up on the island of Montreal. No one waved the
Thank
Canadian
you,
flag.
Mr. Trump. That's
Yeah.
thank you.
But I'll tell you, I moved to Saint Lazare a few years ago, right? Saint Lazare, Hudson, Vaudreuil, that area, 100,000 people. It's about 50% Francophone, 50% Anglophone and Allophone. Canadian flags everywhere, right? It's Federalist Francophones, right? I mean, this is not, I'm not saying there aren't the exact opposite regions, but again, just because we hear from that in the Quebecois media and the Anglophone media owned nationally has no interest in having a regional flavor that really represents itself, doesn't mean that's Quebec, right? It's just an information paradigm of 1.5 million Quebecers talking to themselves.
Yeah, it's all perspective. I don't want to say my neighbors are bad, I'm just saying during the ice storm, we help each other out with barbecues and everything. But the idea is that we don't talk politics.
Yeah.
When I see them putting up a Canadian flag, and they're saying, well, we'll separate soon, and we'll keep this whole area, like Mr. Henderson said, as is, with a passport.
I got teachers from CK Deja that come up to me and they're disgusted that they have to host detentions full of students who are just speaking English to themselves or another language during lunch. Like, it's hard to be proud of that as a Francophone.
That is terrible.
Like, it is actually hard. And it's sort of the point I try to make to a lot of those nationalists is very simple. You know, I speak 3 languages. You know, French is my third of preference. I love the French language, French culture. I love Quebec. But they have made a concerted effort throughout my entire life to make sure that the French language is a language of segregation, of discrimination, of nonsense government, of minority and ethnic politics, right? The French language doesn't deserve these nationalists and separatists, right? I don't know why we enable them to be the destroyers of all the beautiful parts of our culture, right? But this has to be said, it has to be confronted, that the language is not the culture, right? Language is an expression, it's a modality. What you do in the language is the culture. And unfortunately, this is a very easy culture to be disaligned, right? And the truth is, again, it's a minority. It's a minority culture that's told to us is Quebec. Real Quebec is what we've done.
Yeah,
And that's what we need to see back
It's
on
scared
the
that
stage.
it's getting into the schools, and then getting into the hospitals. Like, that to
Yep.
me is like,
But that's when you
Dictatorship.
tolerate governments saying that your bilingual access to health care are completely guaranteed.
Yeah.
By the way, it's illegal to hire anyone who's bilingual. When you tolerate that, right, for decades, and you keep voting parties in that vote that in unanimously, like, it's just, that's what you do, is you bring the common denominator so far down, it doesn't make any sense anymore,
the
right?
intention is like, for a child, is to teach them that something they said or did is wrong, and it's to educate them to do better.
Yeah.
What does detention have to do with them speaking in English?
Let me flip it around another
And
way.
so here you are damaging the children, confusing them,
Yep.
further along in their own self-esteem, because now they're being told they're bad because of the English they spoke.
And then we
Or
have
their
teachers who are
language.
complaining about the distance between the teachers and the
That's-
students.
That's appalling.
And then doing policies like this, right? Then we won't hire people from local communities because they don't integrate with our system. But that's always been how communities have integrated, is through nursing, through schooling, right? I mean,
But
we are creating disaster.
the children, and that to me
Yep,
is like...
it's not tolerable for
I mean,
most people.
Curtis is a psychologist, and I can only imagine already how confused they are, that it's only going to add to their identity, like their confusion of self-identity.
Yep. But the priority is language, it's not child welfare.
Of course
It's
not.
not education.
Of
It's not-
course
and so
not.
this is why we need to accept that there is that
But these
schism in
things
our
have to
society.
be talked about, like, these have to be exposed
Yep.
at a personal level,
Yep.
you know?
And if you notice, every time one of these stories goes to the task force or the party gets some sort of prominence, and my cousin had a little ambulance scenario, what we get is the next 3 weeks of, you know, a francophone hangnail at a dépanneur, basically. Right? We've got children who are not being followed up with the Département de Protection Jeunesse because reports are coming in English and they won't take it. And then like red line reports where those kids aren't supposed to be allowed to go back home, right? And they're being sent back home because no one will talk to the teacher trying to report in English. You know, like, this is what's happening.
This is what we have to
But we'll
expose.
hear instead for 3 weeks about someone who was greeted in English with a, or with
Yes.
a bonjour hi at a
Yes,
dépanneur in
absolutely.
town of Mount Royal instead.
So how do we break this open, wide open?
We just keep talking. And we stop trying to talk to people who fundamentally are trying to run a conversation.
Unfortunately, I don't speak French well, but I have students who come from all over the world, and their main course is to learn English. Some speak French, but they have to learn English. Now, I've met people who have been educated in French school systems that are from other countries. And one time I said to the young man, he said something, I said, "I'm sorry, you're speaking too fast. I don't understand French that well. You don't speak the language of my country?" He went to French school. I said to him, "This is not a country. This is a province. You immigrated to Canada. You didn't immigrate to Quebec. You have a Canadian passport." But his mentality from the school system, he's taught this is a country. And this is how they all think in a school.
So let's be clear, there's 2 French school systems, right? There's the French private school system, which is heavily subsidized, where any 2 educated francophone families send their kids, and that's sort of $6,000 to $12,000 a year in
Yes,
tuition
yes.
versus $40,000 to $50,000. Your kids end up trilingual and they know history at the end of it, right? Then there's the public school system, right? And that is where we are missing 8,000 teachers actively. We don't talk about the other important fact, which is there's 20,000 teachers teaching who aren't teachers. These are ex-police officers in front of, and literally, I was talking to, one of my at a local store, a francophone friend of mine and her children, who have challenges, right, and need a certain type of teacher. That's an SQ officer with no additional training in front of that classroom.
Exactly.
Okay? Who's putting on, videos at lunch. By the way, not the right thing to do with this group of kids. And so we talk about 8,000 missing. We don't talk about 20,000 untrained. We're not doing anything about that. That's 28,000 teachers a day missing in the Francophone public school system. There isn't anyone that can get through the Francophone public school system and claim a decent education.
No,
that is not its purpose. My kids brought home all the pictures on the wall, reminding people of nonsense facts. The Patriots fought for you to be able to speak French at school. Really? That isn't even close to what all of that was about, right? But that's what's on the walls there.
I have a French high school not far from my neighborhood, and I used to walk there. And one time when I was walking and I noticed people coming out, I swear to God, on one hand, I could count the francophones that actually go there. It's basically all immigrants now. And I used to say, we still have no. What I'm saying is like good people coming in. But what I'm saying is like, where are the French children?
No, they've
They all go
defunded
to
the
private
public
schools.
schools.
Private
Defunded the
schools,
public
yeah.
schools,
They're
and
all
it's
out of
only
it.
good for
That's it.
immigrants' kids. And the working class unilingual class, right? So let's be clear. These are nationalist inculcation centers, 100%. It starts with a teacher not teaching a curriculum or being a teacher, right? And it becoming a place of enforcing statism, right? Like the reason why they're anti-religion is not because we're not religious in Quebec. I present to you, this is the most religious Quebec has ever been. Like, blind nationalism is as faith-based as you can get. Right? There's a piece of data that matters for any policy presented. You know, and the examples of learning English. I mean, our own mayor had to leave the province, right, to learn English before coming to Montreal. Like, you know, I know families that I work with when their daughter wanted to be an RCMP officer, and she had to go to Manitoba for 4 months to learn English. She got so mad at her parents for, like, she didn't realize there's English in Quebec, like a few million people. And I don't mean just the Anglophones, like, there's plenty of Francophones, but there's 4.5 million people that speak English here. And we have whole parts of our population that don't know exists, that doesn't know it's existed for 300 years. So yeah, these schools are part of the problem, right? It's not because people aren't trying to do well, or the SQ officer doesn't want to help. He's there, right? He came out of retirement to try to help. We're not doing anything to help these people and ensure a quality education for kids going to these schools. And that's why the English school system is the bane of the Quebec government's existence. Because fundamentally, you can't dial it in through policy. It's investment from the community. It's teachers that want to be there. It's school boards that are actively involved. And it's a community that does not accept, even though our schools are decrepit. I mean, I went to Marymount. You know, these are places that should have been renovated 40 years ago, right? But at least the quality of the education comes from the community, right? And that's something everyone in Quebec wants for their kids. And Francophones are aware that their school system is good.
We just built a beautiful big high school with Francophones only in LaSalle. It's beautiful. They still have the other high school, but the one in LaSalle, it's beautiful. Some of the other schools are decaying.
But you got to put the teachers in it for it to matter.
Well, yes.
It doesn't matter how nice the building is, right?
We have the highest bidder.
It's beautiful. Henderson and Murtis, and thank all of you for coming on a Sunday. I'm afraid we've come to a close, we're almost at 4 o'clock. And I'd like to introduce you to our team. And you have Claudia. Our state Canadian group chat, but she's also come up with our slogan, and it's not just a slogan, strong people stand up for themselves, and stronger people stand up for others. And you don't need an army. We need all of you. We have Charles, who's been in the movement for over 30 years. I met him way back with the Equality Party, where Keith and I were working with the Equality Party. I ran myself twice in LaSalle. But he was with the task force, and many of you here. And the task force is very important, co-founded by Joe and Colin, and you've got Andrew Cadell doing a great job. And we've done a legal challenge, but now we have grassroots, and this is where I really love it, where all of us get involved. And Mario, people like you, we need a general on the ground. And we have our volunteers, and we have Claudia, who talked, another Claudia, who came out when we were protesting the Santa Cabrini. The pushback works, and Cynthia is the brainchild with Claudia on getting all these people out. And we've had pushbacks work. We're not going to take it anymore. And very thank Mary as well, just a recent volunteer and member. But I'd like to introduce you to Jonathan Gray, who is a teacher who ran for us in West Garden. West Garden is very big, the corridor of all the areas who voted no twice federally, so if you want to help. And he's responsible for working on our public image. So a lot of us are going to be working, helping Joe. There's going to be a lot of hopefully blogging and sort of non-traditional media. And I'm going to ask you if you feel like singing "Oh Canada." And if you do, please stand.
Let's do it. Let's go back to grade school. When you were there. All right, who's going to lead us off?
Keith Henderson.
We see thee rise, the true north strong. our land.